On this introduction to the Faith Informing podcast, I have a special guest. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Cece.
Cece is my daughter and she is 8 years old and she's learning about science at school. Cece, what did you learn or what was one of your favorite things in science class this year at school? She's giving me a blank look. But before we recorded, she said she loves science class because they get to explore all kinds of things, like how seeds are made, and they get to make little crafts to imagine what a seed is like. And I know they did all kinds of other things as well. And I think science is a wonderful way to foster your curiosity. The more we are curious about the natural world around us, the more we'll want to explore science. So listen in to today's episode as Janet and I talk about this relationship between faith and science. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Dr. Janet Ray about her newest book entitled The God of Monkey Science: People of Faith in a Modern Scientific World. Janet is a passionate science educator and has spent more than a decade teaching and writing about science, faith, and culture. Most recently, she's done a lot of work on why evangelicals have been leading voices in climate change denial and anti-vaccine movements. So stay tuned. This is going to be a fun episode. And so I am so happy, Janet, to have you on the show today. And I was wondering if you would just start by telling us a little bit about yourself. One of the way I like to frame this question is kind of thinking about the nouns in your early life, like who were the people, where were the places, and what were the things that were influencing you in those early years?
Yeah. Well, I am a Texan, born and raised. I grew up in a small town in Texas where church was absolutely central to our lives. All my parents' friends were at church. I was an only child for 5 years, so I never saw another kid unless it was at church. And so church was overall a positive experience in my life. And I like to say that probably, I have to say we were at church 3 times a week minimum: Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and every night of the week if it happened to be a gospel meeting, what a lot of denominations call revivals, but we called it gospel meetings. And probably the most traumatizing part of that upbringing was the fact that I never saw The Wizard of Oz until I was an adult. Because, back in the Paleolithic, before there was on-demand streaming or recording, The Wizard of Oz only broadcast once a year, and it only broadcast on Sunday night. And so we were at church every Sunday night. And so I never saw The Wizard of Oz until I was an adult. But that, if that's the most trauma I have, I guess I'm doing pretty good.
That's hilarious. I just have to interrupt there. I literally had one of my members in my congregation tell me this very same story that she experienced as a kid, because this church, it doesn't now, but back in the day, had the Sunday evening services, and she said she never got to stay home and watch The Wizard of Oz.
No. And you also never got to see the Wide World of Disney because it was also on Sunday night, unless you were lucky enough to be sick. If you were lucky enough to be sick, you could stay home and watch it. But, in the tradition of my growing up, we would have no more have questioned the literal nature of the Bible in general and Genesis specifically, than we would have questioned the existence of Jesus. And, honestly, I don't recall any science or evolution ever being denigrated from the pulpit because a literal reading was just the default. So there was no reason to do any kind of apologetics, against science at all. But, so that's where I just kind of floated along until I was in seventh grade. And believe it or not, in those days in Texas, science was an elective for seventh graders. And so I decided that I wanted to take choir because I thought it sounded fun. But my dad was a teacher in the middle school where I was going to be a student. And he's very, very, self-disciplined, triple type A person. I don't know where I get that. And he did not like what he thought was a lack of discipline. So he, voluntold me that I was going to be in the science class. And to this day, I credit my dad with changing the trajectory of my life. It was a really, really good science class for middle school in Texas in the 70s. But looking back on it, I would still say it was an excellent science elective. We went through all of the different, what we called kingdoms, animal kingdoms, all the phyla at the time. And I had absolutely no vocabulary to express what I'm about to say at the time. I just remembered distinctly having these thoughts that as we would go work our way through all the different groups of animals, we did dissections, real live dissections, not the virtual stuff that kids do now. And I remember having these thoughts that, well, first of all, in my world, animals were things like puppies and kitties and the cows and the sheep that I saw, at my house. But here were things like sea stars without heads and earthworms and mussels and other animals like this that were animals. And I mean, that just may seem like a, no kidding, realization, but to learn that there were a wide range of things that could be classified as an animal. And then as we dissected, I distinctly remember having the thought that these animals are connected somehow. Like this digestive system, this circulatory system just seems to be a modification of a circulatory system or a digestive system that I saw in this simpler animal. And I had, again, no vocabulary to express those thoughts. I just remember having those thoughts. And so, just filed it away. Again, took my love for science into high school. I remember having some of the same thoughts, but again, no vocabulary to express it. I actually went on to university, a Christian university that I loved and still love. And I was a biology major where we conveniently never discussed the topic of evolution. One of our professors, my favorite professor, actually just said, here it is in your textbook, your biology majors, you need to know it. End of discussion. That was it. And so, I went on, I taught middle school science for a while. Then I got on the mommy track and, had kids. And then maybe 10 years after I graduated, my husband and I were both biology majors. He went on to medical school at the same university. About 10 years after we graduated was a second event that I consider a trajectory change in my life. There was an individual who had no connection to my Christian university whatsoever, but he was a big, young earth creationist who had started a young earth creationist publishing house. And he decided to go after the careers of two of the biology professors at my university, one of whom was the guy who was my favorite professor. In fact, I taught labs for him as an undergraduate and took, all of his classes. One was him and one was another guy. and went after their careers because by this point, 10 years later, the biology department was being much more overt about teaching evolution science to the majors. And it did not have a completely good ending to this story. One of the professors was just a tough old guy, and he withstood the storm. My professor, it just destroyed him. He resigned from his position as an elder in his church. He was humiliated that anyone would, on a national level, hold him up to be this man who was teaching atheism to these Christian students. And I, in the days before the internet, I didn't know all this until after the fact. He resigned. He actually passed away not too long after that. It really did just really destroy him emotionally. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go back to my university, which, by the way, now openly teaches evolution as the foundational theory of biology. And they did shortly after that horrible series of events, because the science department went to the administration and said, we are not a Bible college, we are a research university, and we will prepare our students. So that is a good ending there. But I had the opportunity to talk to an emeritus professor who was still at my university, who was there at the time. And he said, ironically, this professor was so religiously conservative, he squeaked, but he was a man of science and he was going to teach science. And he said it just destroyed him. So I consider that a trajectory change in my life because, I had not ever really been on the young earth bandwagon. I was kind of as a biology major, biology teacher, I was kind of like, can I just close one eye and squint and make the fossil record fit the days of creation? Because, I just couldn't go there with the young earth. But with this event happening at my university, so traumatic there in that department, I wanted to know more. And so I started on a journey. My husband started on his journey. We read, we listened, we read people of faith who accepted evolution. We read books about it. And it wasn't a hard sell because we were both biologists and it just made sense. And so, I went to graduate school. Like I said, I was on the mommy track, did the master's and did the PhD a little slower than some because of the kids in tow. But all along, I started reading more. Probably about 10, 12 years ago or more, I started a blog reviewing books and writing about science and faith. And maybe about 10 years after that, I wrote the first book and then the second book. And then here we are. It's just my passion is to explain science to those without a science background and to make science accessible to people who aren't scientists, and particularly those who come from a faith that makes them somewhat hesitant to completely trust what science says.
Thank you so much for that. That's so helpful to hear your background. I mean, it's amazing. What strikes me about that story with your professor is that when an outside person comes into a community with an agenda that says it's kind of my way or the highway, either you do it my way and you're following God, or you're doing it your way and you're following atheism, you can really destroy people. That has a potential to destroy people's lives. Like this debate over young Earth creationism versus evolution, or intelligent design versus evolutionism, has had fatalities. It's affected real people, and I so appreciate you sharing about that. Just how personal this is for you, and how it did change the trajectory of your life. That's amazing. If you've been listening to the Faith Informing podcast for a few episodes now, could you do me a favor? Like and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, and share this episode with your family and friends through social media. Thanks so much. Now on to the episode. The way that evolutionary thought threatens evangelicals is an interesting topic, and you get at that in the God of Monkey Science book. When I was a kid, I definitely grew up in a church that was, I would describe them as fundamentalists. In Canada, where I grew up, the word evangelical wasn't really used. That was more of an American thing. But very similarly, the church I grew up in was, literalist readers of the Bible, especially when it came to Genesis 1 and 2. And I distinctly remember, I don't know how old I was. I might have been 12, 13, and our pastor at the time, and this is a pretty big church for Canada, probably 500 or 600 people. And he said in a sermon, the greatest threat to Christianity is evolution. And I'll never forget that, because even as a kid, it seemed, well, I mean, I didn't know any difference, so I was just okay. But like as I got older, I was like, that it just made less and less sense to me as how is this such a threat? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you describe evangelicals in your book. You say you describe them doctrinally, socially, and kind of as an evangelical mindset. And I was wondering, could you tease that out a bit for us?
If you look at evangelicalism as a movement, especially the modern face of evangelicalism, it doesn't really describe where you go to church or what your religious denomination or your tradition is. It's more of a mindset. And more, what we are finding, at least in surveys and studies, is that people who are Catholic, people who are Orthodox, people who are Mormon, would self-identify as evangelicals, either by term or just by checking boxes on descriptors. And a growing number of people who don't identify with any particular religious group or tradition would identify themselves as evangelical, either by term or by description. And so, there are some doctrinal hallmarks of classic evangelicalism, but again, those are not the most important boxes to check in 21st century versions of evangelicalism. More than anything, it is a cultural way of describing yourself. More and more, we see these people outside of traditional Protestant religions, fundamentalist type religions that would traditionally be considered evangelical. We're finding people outside of those, or people just outside of any identification with a particular church or tradition, because they identify with evangelicals culturally. It's interesting when you were talking about your church growing up and hearing, the idea that evolution was, what did you say, going to destroy
the greatest threat to Christianity.
Yeah. The pastor of the ginormous First Baptist Church in downtown Dallas is Robert Jeffress. He is all over American cable news shows. He's a big culture warrior. He was a spiritual advisor to Donald Trump during his presidency, and is still quite often interviewed for his ideas on all things cultural. Well, in one of his books that he has published, Dr. Jeffress said, and I'm not going to quote this exactly, but the book is called Twilight/Gleaming. He says that the intolerance for the scientific community, let's take a big broad brush there, a big broad brush, paint all the scientists, the intolerance of the scientific community for biblical creation is an indicator of a tide of evil about to destroy our country. And this book just came out just a few years ago. And so it's not something that's in the past. This is someone with the microphone of some of the biggest audiences in our country on cable news networks, cable news shows, talk shows, radio, TV. And in his estimation, the scientific community's rejection of a literal biblical creation is a tide of evil that's going to destroy our country. And so you can see there that this is given as an evangelical message. His book was a religious book. And so within this context of American evangelicalism, you have this idea that science is out to destroy our culture, that science is evil. And so you get all this big mishmash, crossing of borders, crossing of boundaries. And before you know it, scientists are the enemy.
And you make that really clear in this book, in The God of Monkey Science. I think your first book was more about, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was more about trying to better understand how evolution does not have to be against the Bible or the Bible against evolution, that faith and science can have a working relationship. But this book is more focused on this kind of idea that if you want to be a real Christian, you gotta reject science altogether, not just evolution, but you talk a lot about climate science and vaccine science related to COVID. So you say at one point, you say evolution, climate science, and COVID appear to be some sort of denialist package deal. And I'm sure many of our listeners can think of anecdotal evidence in their own life of this. I know I can. I know lots. I know individuals who, yeah, if they're denying evolution, they also deny the vaccines and deny climate change and everything like that. What led you to kind of make those connections between those three big groups?
Well, you know, as I thought about it, because, well, you know, as I said in God of Monkey Science, what kind of started me off on this path, we were in the midst of COVID, and I was, making a case online that Texas's mask mandate was being lifted too early, and someone disagreed with me and called it again my monkey god science. And I just, that sent me down a rabbit trail because I wasn't talking about evolution. I was talking about COVID and masking and pandemics and public health. And so, just sent me on this deep dive. And what I found is that for decades, unsurprisingly, this was not a surprise to me, but for decades, people of faith have been told that scientists are lying to them about evolution. And I don't use that word lie lightly, because literally you will find in creationist literature that scientists are liars, that they are lying to you and to your children about evolution because they themselves are atheists and they want you to be an atheist too. And scientists don't want to be accountable to God, so they made up evolution. You'll actually see that language in creationist, to this day, creationist literature. So you have this large community of people, that take their faith seriously, take the Bible seriously. And in these precincts, you have been told for decades that scientists are lying about fossils, that scientists are hiding evidence for creation, that scientists are hiding evidence for a young earth. And you've been told this by people you respect, through books given to you by people you respect. And so we have generations who have been brought up thinking that when it comes to evolution and the age of the earth, that scientists are lying. Scientists are hiding evidence. Scientists make things up in order to make a point. So when we found ourselves in the middle of a deadly worldwide pandemic, and people were just shocked in many ways to see that the church, in many ways, was leading the charge, denying scientists, was leading the charge against scientists, and some of the worst things that were said about Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Anthony Fauci, some of the worst things that were said about these people leading our pandemic response came out of evangelical headquarters. We heard scientists are lying to us about this virus. Scientists made up the severity of this virus. Here's one we heard a lot. Scientists are hiding the evidence for these cures that they don't want us to know about, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And so what I saw was the same arguments that for decades had been thrown against evolution. These exact same arguments were just retooled and thrown against pandemic scientists. We didn't trust scientists. We thought they were hiding things from us. We thought that that the evidence that they were giving us was just their opinions, and that there were other opinions out there that were just as valid. And then it doesn't take long to segue over into climate science. And Katharine Hayhoe, who is a outspoken Christian and one of the world leaders in studying climate change, will tell you that she hears the same thing. And she would say that those that come into her socials who are anti-climate science are almost always anti-masking on their own social media pages. And so there just seems to be this, this overlap, this playbook of some sort. And so the second book was just a deep dive into seeing what was at play there. Why was nobody, wanting to debate photosynthesis, but we want to debate evolution, and we want to debate the science behind a pandemic response, or we want to debate the evidence that the climate is warming due to man-made problems and causes. So what is it about it? And there's I found a lot of things. A lot of it is cultural, and a lot of it is underlying is a religious, even a theological, even behind COVID, even behind climate science. It's not a surprise that there's a religious underpinning to evolution denial, but a big factor in all three of these is science has been made a front in a culture war. And if an area of science offends or is said to offend an area of culture that evangelicals are in battle for, then we just throw science in their baby bathwater, everything.
I know at one point in the book you say when religion and science, or when religion and politics mix, the result is politics.
Yeah.
And I love that line. But as you're talking now, I also wonder, when science and politics mix, is politics the results? Like, in the sense that, like, from with COVID and climate change and evolution, politics have gotten so involved in all of them that it's no longer, you're no longer making a decision to what you think about COVID vaccines or what you think about climate change. It's not just a matter of like this is what I think about the science. It's also like part of your political stripes. Like, what side am I on? And so I
Right.
wonder, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, and absolutely, whether you are participating in groupthink uh, with your religious tradition, or whether you're participating in groupthink with your political affiliation, um, the result is the same, and that's where it gets so murky with
Mm,
evangelicalism and politics. I think in monkey science, I talked about this study where in 2016, before the 2016 presidential election, there was a survey that looked at people who supported former President Trump and whether or not they identified as evangelicals, and whatever that stat was. By the time the 2020 election rolled around, surveying that same group of people, the number who identified as evangelicals had gone up. And so people that were in a definitively political arena, who you voted for president, had changed how they identified religiously, that more began to identify as evangelicals. And so there is just this mix of our politics and our religion. And I'm not sure we can always, parse it out as to
mhm.
what is what. They've become such a conglomeration there.
Yeah, it does get so messy that, yeah, sometimes it can be like, yeah, why do, like, even when I'm examining my own viewpoints, it can be hard. It's like, you're like, am I just saying I agree with this because, 12 people around me also agree with it?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it for another reason? And I like um I like how you emphasize focusing on, like, when you're listening to someone talk about science, or I would say if you're listening to someone talk about the Bible or theology, um, are you listening because they have qualifications, or are you
Mm-hmm.
listening because they're actually dealing with evidence? And I thought that was a really good point, that so often we just get caught up into listening to certain people because they have certain credentials, or they have a big following. Um, and we don't actually think about what they're saying to us, and is it based on any evidence, both in science and theology. I feel like in your book you mention John MacArthur, the pastor
Mm-hmm.
from Southern California, quite a bit. And I think with him, he has such a huge following, that people kind of it's easy for people to ignore, um, that not everything he says is accurate or based on reality. And I think you point that out really well in your book.
Yeah, I try to make the point that there is a difference between someone speaking from a position of authority and someone speaking from a position of expertise.
Mm,
MacArthur is a great example of that. He is definitely someone who speaks from a platform of authority. But does he have expertise, or is he quoting experts in
mm,
the fields in which he is speaking? If MacArthur spoke a lot during the pandemic about pandemic and science and public health issues, but he would obviously speak as an authority. But was he speaking as an expert in the field? No. Or was he quoting and talking about what experts in the field have to say? And I talked about this in the book too. And this maybe, too many years ago, but it was a big deal during the pandemic. This group of doctors that stood in front of the Supreme Court and called themselves America's frontline doctors and talked about all the alternative cures that the government was trying to keep away from us. And here they are in their white coats in front of the Supreme Court. And they're telling you that you need to take these alternative treatments for COVID. But it didn't take too much of a deep dive to find out that while they had the trappings of authority, the white coat, the Supreme Court, the title of doctor, none of them were experts in fields of epidemiology, infectious disease, nor were they referencing any experts in those fields. And so I think it's important for those of us who aren't research scientists. We can't go and we can't literally do all of our own research, but that we understand that there is a difference between those speaking with authority and those speaking with expertise, because there is a giant gulf between the two. And, to understand that just because someone has a position of authority does not mean that they are speaking as an expert in a field.
And I think it's also a kind of a red flag when that authority is, well, it usually is like one person, or maybe like in the doctors you mentioned on the steps of the Supreme Court, it's a group of people. But when you think about when science is done, it's done in a community. It's not like Anthony Fauci was the one calling all the shots on what was science during the pandemic. It was a community.
Right. And we hear about the consensus of the scientists, consensus of science, and a lot of people, kind of denigrate that saying. But what people don't generally understand, that it's not actually a consensus of scientists; it's a consensus of the science evidence. That it is evidence that comes together and comes to a uniform conclusion, that these aren't just dark rooms of scientists meeting together and voting in secret as to what science is going to be. It is published, peer-reviewed studies. And then when you conglomerate the studies together, what is the consensus of the findings? And so when we talk about the consensus of scientists or the consensus of science, we're not talking about a vote. We're talking about evidence, and where disparate lines of evidence lead us to, where they're pointing us to. I use this example in my intro biology classes. I put this photograph of a woman who I think it was prior to 2020, because she made the announcement January 1 of 2020. She had won the year or so before, she had won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. And in January 1 of 2020, she had to announce that she was retracting a peer-reviewed article, not on the Nobel Prize-winning research, but on some other research that she had done, because it could not be duplicated. Once it was peer-reviewed, other scientists could not duplicate it. There had been a problem with reporting some of the data. So it wasn't her Nobel-winning literature, but she was a Nobel-winning scientist. And once she published subsequent studies, people pointed out and said, that's wrong. You're wrong about that. Scientists love to prove each other wrong. And so Nobel Prize winning scientist or not, if you're wrong about something, someone is going to point it out. And that's why it always amuses me when people talk about this giant cabal of scientists who are conspiring to hide evidence for whatever from the public. Scientists love to prove each other wrong.
That's such a good point, and it makes me think of why these pastoral authorities that like John MacArthur, why I think it's tough for Christians sometimes when they're hearing authorities like that speak, because they're like, what that authority is constantly saying, God said this, and you can't prove God wrong. So it's like it's really challenging when God gets involved, so to speak.
Right. And this is one of my favorite examples. It came out after Monkey Science already went into editing and had to be sent to the publisher. But it's a great example of some of the things I talk about in the book. about a year ago. I think it is actually the largest Christian university in the United States, Liberty University, about tens of thousands of students. And in their convocation, their university-wide convocation, there were 3 gentlemen on the stage, each with graduate degrees in some field of earth science. And so here we are, they have all the trappings of authority, PhDs behind their names, studies in earth science, and they are on the stage at this large convocation at a university. And the topic of that particular convocation was evidence for a worldwide global flood 4,000 years ago. They were talking about the science evidence for a global flood 4,000 years ago. But the speaker makes the point to say that if you accept the authority of the Bible, all evidence will point to a global flood 4,000 years ago. And so before we even look at the evidence, we have to, say, first of all, before we even look at the evidence, you have to believe in the authority of the Bible. And if you believe in the authority of the Bible, the evidence will always say this. So again, that's not how science works. Science doesn't start with a preconceived idea and then look for evidence to back itself up. Science starts with a question and then looks for answers, to answer that question, whichever direction it will take you. And so, it's frustrating to me as a science educator to think about these thousands of young adults at a Christian university, hopefully because they want to be there. And these individuals with all of this authority behind them, but telling them that the way science works is you start with a presupposition and then you try to back yourself up, which is not how science works.
Yeah.
In fact, I tell my students this also, that when we talk about, a hypothesis to begin a science study, if a hypothesis turns out to be correct, scientists don't write it up by saying, yeah, that's right. They might say that to their peers, but they don't write that. What they say instead is something along the lines of, we failed to reject our hypothesis, which is very convoluted, but it makes the point. We're not trying to prove a preconception. We're trying to find evidence and see where the evidence brings us.
Yeah, that's such a different way of looking at of both doing science, but also, when you're reading and studying the Bible, if you have, everyone has preconceived notions going in. They were taught things in their Sunday school or from a friend or whatever, from their parents. But when you go into reading the Bible and doing theology, if you have the mindset that you can figure all of this out and you can kind of put God in a box, you are going to run into some walls pretty quick or into some hurdles, because one of my favorite quotes is from a church father named Augustine, and he says, you should, when you're doing theology, you should seek as expecting to find, and find expecting still to seek. And it's a sense that it's an ongoing learning process, that the goal is not to come to the end of it, but is to continue to engage deeper and deeper. And oftentimes I don't think we think about that very well when it comes to our faith, that we want it to be simple and tidy. And so if there's anything in the science world that's like possibly contradicting what we may think or believe, it's like that's a big threat to our well-being. And you say in the first century, they knew we were Christians by our love. And in the 21st century, they'll know we are Christians by our fight for rights. And I wondered if you could just a couple of minutes, just kind of conclude with that on why why is there's this pull into having our rights and our freedom, and how might that be um, making it difficult for us to actually lead in or lean into love in the way that we're called to as Christians?
Well, again, I find the precursors to that in the fight against evolution. Ever since, the days of the Scopes trial, we've seen over the decades uh, court trials at both the state and federal level, school boards, state and local level. We see all of these fights for the right to teach alternatives to evolution in public school classrooms. And, when that was thrown out by the Supreme Court a couple of decades ago, we revamped. And this time we are fighting for the right to teach strengths and weaknesses of theories. But, nobody is arguing to teach the strengths and weaknesses of photosynthesis. What we want to teach the strengths and weaknesses of is evolution and climate science. And so we have a long history of going to courts, going to school boards, and fighting for the right to teach what has been determined by the Supreme Court of the United States and by another federal court in Pennsylvania to be a religious topic. And so we have melded this fight for rights with what we believe religiously. Well, fast forward to our COVID pandemic. And what we saw time and time again were churches that were hiring attorneys to fight for the right to assemble in public and to fight for the right to assemble in the numbers that they had always been assembling in, and for the right to assemble mask free. Not just churches, but businesses would fight for the right to assemble mask free. But if you look below the surfaces of those who fought outside church, it was always going to be, a religious connection there. And so in the book, I just kind of a thought exercise, what if we took that money that we spent to hire attorneys, and MacArthur's church did that. They were one of the biggest churches to do that, was to hire attorneys to fight for the right to assemble in numbers, assemble publicly, assemble mask-free. What if churches took the money that they used from their offerings to hire attorneys to fight for the rights to do this? What if they took that money instead and supported those in their communities that couldn't work from home or lived in multi-generational homes? Now, this reminds me, you asked me if I was ever pushed back. I do remember being pushed back against people that I knew, friends, when I would write about something that was called the Great Barrington Declaration. That was big during the COVID pandemic. We may have slept since then and we'd forgotten about it. But it was came out of a libertarian think tank. And the idea was, forget waiting for a vaccine. Let's just let the virus rip roar through the public. Let's protect the most vulnerable, I guess, meaning the elderly. Let's protect the elderly and just let everybody else get it. And we'll get over it because we're healthy and we can get the economy. It was all about getting the economy going again. And so, I pushed back against this idea, and I did have people pushing back against me, friends, Christian friends that pushed back against me. But my point was, that is a fantasy world. There are people that live in multi-generational homes. Most middle-class families don't have grandma, great-grandma living with them or a parent living with them. But if you do, you are living with someone who was vulnerable to this virus. And so if we just say all bets are off and we'll just silo the old people somewhere, that's not reality. And the reality is there are a lot of people in our country who could not work from home, that were forced to go out and work in service industries and food industries and things that kept the rest of us alive. And so, it was just disappointing to see how many people of faith were arguing for positions like the Great Barrington Declaration that seemed to ignore that everyone doesn't live this life where you can work from home and you only have your little nuclear family living with you. And so, during the pandemic, we became known as people of faith, as those who are going to go to court, fight for our rights to assemble, fight for our rights to reopen the economy because we don't like we're losing money here. We were fighting for our rights instead of thinking, how can we, as a large community of faith, respond as people of faith to those who are hurting more than we are in this pandemic.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think it's, if there will be many years where we reflect on what happened during the pandemic.
Mhm.
And, I think about Jesus's call on us to care for the most vulnerable. And even him becoming vulnerable by becoming a human being, there's a sense in the Christian faith that it's always a call to a kind of a downward trajectory. It's not climbing the ladder. It's not like getting rich. It's not, trying to seclude yourself, but it's always going to be with those who have been rejected, who are most at risk. And the Christian church throughout history has often been really good at doing just that.
Right.
But during the pandemic, and it really did not do a good job of that. And so I think it's a really good reminder of whenever we're, as Christians, engaged in political conversations and we're focused on, well, how can this best benefit me? I think one question that we might want to ask ourselves is, well, Jesus calls me to focus not just on me, but also on my neighbors, and my neighbors are everyone. So how does this affect the larger community? How does this affect my poorest neighbors? So I think that's you brought that out really well in the book, and I really appreciated that. So
Thank you.
that's all the time we have. Thank you, Janet, again for being on the podcast today. Like, I really appreciated this conversation. Like I said before we started recording, I absolutely love your books. Found them super engaging and encourage our listeners to pick up a copy. And I just pray that God would bless you as you continue to teach and write on the topics of faith, science, and culture. It's vital work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me and listening in on my conversation with Dr. Janet Ray. Be sure to pick up a copy of her book, The God of Monkey Science. There's so much to learn from that book, and you'll learn so much more than we could cover in this one episode. Also, if you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, and share this episode with your friends and family through social media. Until next time, take good care.